Welcome, history enthusiasts. Today, we drift deep into the hidden lives of medieval peasants and uncover the fascinating story of why some of them chose to live underground. From ingenious survival strategies to the daily struggles and resilience of ordinary people, this journey will take you beneath the surface and reveal a side of history rarely seen. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more captivating historical explorations, uncovering secrets from the past that will leave you amazed. Now, let's descend into the world beneath medieval Europe and discover the incredible story of life underground. Imagine opening your eyes each morning not to the pale light slipping through a window, not to the sound of carts rattling down a street or roosters crowing in a distant yard, but to darkness, a thick, swallowing darkness. The air around you is cool, slightly damp, carrying the smell of earth and smoke that never quite leaves your clothes. Above your head is no ceiling of timber beams or stone, but packed soil, held in place by rough wooden supports. You are not in a cellar beneath a house. This is the house. This is home for countless medieval peasants. Life began and ended beneath the surface of the ground. To modern eyes, the idea feels shocking, even horrifying. We associate underground spaces with graves, prisons, or hiding places meant only for emergencies, but in the medieval world, especially for the poorest people, living beneath the earth was not madness. It was not superstition. It was a calculated response to a world that offered very little mercy. To understand why, we must first forget everything romantic we think we know about the Middle Ages. This was not an era of stone castles rising proudly over peaceful villages, where smiling farmers worked green fields under the protection of noble lords. That image belongs to paintings and legends, not to the lived reality of ordinary people. For the peasant, the medieval world was a place of constant uncertainty. Hunger was always close. Violence was never far away. Survival required adaptation, and sometimes adaptation meant digging down instead of building up. Most peasants were born into a life they could never escape. They did not choose where they lived, what they worked, or who ruled over them. Land belonged to lords. Forests belonged to lords. Even rivers and mills were controlled by those with power. A peasant's body was often the only thing they truly owned, and even that was burdened by taxes, labor obligations, and service. In such a world, building a strong house above ground was not simply difficult. It was often impossible. Stone was expensive and restricted. Timber was controlled and limited. Permission to cut trees could be denied or heavily taxed. Skilled labor was rare. And even if a peasant managed to build a modest wooden structure, it offered little real protection. A single torch could reduce it to ash. A single storm could tear it apart. A single passing army could destroy it without a second thought. Above ground, visibility was danger. Smoke rising from a chimney signaled life, and life meant food, animals, and goods worth stealing. Light from a window at night marked a target. Sound carried easily across open land. A village could be seen from miles away, and in a time of raids, that visibility could mean death. Going underground changed everything. By digging into the earth, peasants could make themselves harder to see, harder to hear, and harder to reach. From a distance, an underground dwelling might appear as nothing more than a slight dip in the ground, covered with grass or mud. There were no walls to spot, no roofs to set on fire, no obvious signs of life. Smoke from cooking fires could be filtered and dispersed, escaping quietly rather than rising in a visible column. Noise was muffled by soil and wood. In times of danger, this invisibility could be the difference between survival and destruction, but fear of attack was only one part of the story. The medieval climate itself was a relentless enemy. Winters were long, dark, and bitterly cold. There was no central heating, no insulation, no modern clothing. A cold winter could kill just as effectively as a sword. Frostbite, hypothermia, and starvation stalked entire communities. In such conditions, the earth offered something precious: stability. Below the surface, temperatures remained more constant, the ground insulated against freezing winds and scorching summer heat, while an above-ground hut might be torn apart by storms or filled with snow. An underground dwelling remained sheltered. The earth absorbed the violence of the weather. It did not crack like wood or crumble like poorly laid stone. It endured. For a peasant family, endurance mattered more than comfort. Comfort was a luxury reserved for those with wealth and power. For everyone else, life was about reducing risk. Underground living reduced exposure to cold, to wind, to enemies, and sometimes even to the gaze of authority. Lords could see houses above ground. They could count them, tax them, and demand labor from those who lived inside. Underground dwellings, especially in scattered rural areas, were easier to overlook. This is not to say that underground life was easy or pleasant. Darkness dominated daily existence. Light came from small fires or crude oil lamps, their glow weak and flickering. Smoke often lingered, stinging the eyes and lungs. Ventilation was poor. Moisture seeped through walls. Mold grew silently. Insects thrived. Disease spread easily in cramped, enclosed spaces. Children grew up without sunlight touching their faces for much of the day. Elders coughed endlessly from smoke and damp air. Yet even so, these homes persisted. Why? Because the alternative was often worse. Above ground meant exposure to hunger, violence, weather, and authority. Underground meant concealment, insulation, and a fragile sense of control in a world that offered peasants almost none. There is also a psychological element we must consider. Living underground shaped how medieval peasants saw the world and their place in it. Life was not imagined as a journey upward toward progress and improvement. It was a struggle to endure, to hold on, to remain unseen and alive. The earth was not merely dirt. It was protection, shelter, and in some ways, a companion. To live beneath the ground was to live close to death, but also close to survival. The same soil that would one day receive their bodies in burial was the soil that protected them in life. This proximity was not morbid to medieval peasants. It was familiar. Death was ever present in their world. Infant mortality was high. Plagues swept through regions without warning. Life expectancy was short. Living underground was not a reminder of death. It was a defense against it. From the perspective of the powerful, these lives were barely visible. Chronicles recorded the deeds of kings, the battles of knights, the construction of cathedrals. The everyday reality of peasants rarely appeared in written history. Their underground homes left few traces. Wood rotted, earth collapsed, generations passed, and the evidence vanished. But absence from records does not mean absence from reality. Millions of people lived this way across medieval Europe. Their lives unfolded quietly beneath the surface, unseen by history but essential to it. They farmed the land, produced food, paid taxes, and supported the entire social structure above them. Castles stood because peasants survived. Armies marched because peasants fed them. Kingdoms endured because ordinary people found ways to live, even when life pushed them underground. When we ask why medieval peasants lived beneath the earth, we are not just asking about architecture or climate. We are asking about inequality, fear, resilience, and adaptation. We are asking how human beings respond when stripped of power and choice. They adapt, they endure, they dig. Beneath the ground, medieval peasants carved out fragile spaces of survival in a world that gave them little else. Their homes were dark, damp, and harsh, but they were theirs, And in an age where ownership was rare and safety rarer still, that mattered more than anything else. This hidden life beneath the soil is not a footnote to history. It is a reminder that history is not only written in stone towers and royal decrees, but also in silence, darkness, and the quiet determination of people who refused to disappear, even when the world forced them underground. The Middle Ages were not a fairy tale. That is the first truth we must confront before trying to understand the lives of peasants. We often imagine knights in shining armor, towering castles, and bustling medieval towns filled with joyous villagers, market stalls brimming with colorful fabrics, and children playing freely in the streets. Paintings, films, and popular culture have shaped this picture, but for the vast majority of people in medieval Europe, this was an illusion. The reality was harsh, unforgiving, and filled with challenges that could determine life or death every day. For peasants, the backbone of medieval society, their world was shaped by labor, hierarchy, and an unrelenting struggle against forces both human and natural. They were the ones who tilled the fields, harvested the crops, tended to livestock, and provided food not just for themselves, but for the lords, clergy, and knights who lived in comfort far above them. Their labor sustained kingdoms, yet they themselves had little control over the conditions of their existence. They were bound to the land, to the obligations of the feudal system, and to the whims of those with wealth and power. Hunger was never a distant threat. It was constant, like a shadow following every family from season to season. Crops failed, whether from drought, flood, or disease, and the consequences were immediate and devastating. A single poor harvest could mean weeks of empty bellies, and a succession of bad seasons could push entire villages into famine. Grain prices fluctuated wildly, and because peasants did not control the land, they often had to give the majority of what they grew to their lord, leaving barely enough to survive. The system was merciless. A peasant's hard work did not guarantee sustenance. It only guaranteed that they were not free. Disease was another ever-present threat. The medieval period lacked modern medical knowledge. Illnesses that today might be treated with a pill or a simple procedure were then death sentences. Fevers, infections, parasites, and plagues swept through villages with terrifying speed. Children were especially vulnerable. Infant mortality was staggering, and families were accustomed to losing one or more children before they reached adulthood. Life expectancy was low, often just 40 years, though some might live longer if luck, health, and circumstances allowed. This reality shaped every decision, every choice, every aspect of daily life. Peasants understood that survival was fragile, temporary, and demanded vigilance at all times. Violence was never far away. The medieval world was punctuated by warfare, not as distant headlines in newspapers, but as immediate, tangible terror. Wars between kingdoms and principalities were frequent. Armies marched across the land, claiming resources, looting villages, and leaving devastation in their wake. Local lords and feudal overlords often demanded soldiers, taxes, or supplies, and peasants were left to comply or suffer the consequences. Bandits and thieves were also a constant danger, roaming the countryside with impunity, attacking travelers or isolated homesteads. Even within villages, conflicts could arise, disputes over land, tools, or livestock occasionally erupting into deadly violence. For the peasant, safety was never assumed, only hoped for, and often it was the hope that mattered more than the reality. A simple wooden house, the kind that many peasants might have managed to construct, offered little protection against these threats. Wood was vulnerable to fire. Thatched roofs could ignite from a single spark. Walls were not sturdy enough to resist weapons, and windows, if they existed at all, were weak and easily broken. During raids or skirmishes, a peasant family's home could be destroyed in minutes, and with it, everything they owned. There was no fire department to call, no local constable to intervene, and no neighbors guaranteed to defend them. Survival often depended on ingenuity, concealment, and sheer luck. The landscape itself was unforgiving. Europe in the Middle Ages was a land shaped by its environment. Dense forests provided resources, but also harbored predators and bandits. Open plains left villages exposed to raiders and armies alike. Rivers and streams were crucial for water, but they could flood, washing away crops, homes, and livelihoods. The seasons dictated life. Winter could be lethal, with freezing temperatures and snowstorms that isolated communities, made travel impossible, and destroyed food supplies. Summer brought its own dangers, from heat to drought, from disease, carrying insects to crop devastation. Peasants lived with these cycles intimately, and their survival depended on their ability to anticipate, adapt, and endure. For many peasants, survival was not simply a matter of physical endurance. It was a test of psychological resilience. The constant awareness of death, danger, and scarcity shaped not only how they lived, but how they thought about life itself. Religion played a central role in this psychological framework. Catholicism, which dominated medieval Europe, offered both comfort and structure. The church was a source of moral guidance, social organization, and sometimes charity. Yet it also reinforced the social hierarchy, teaching peasants that their place in life was ordained by God. Endurance, humility, and acceptance were virtues, and suffering was often seen as part of a divine plan. Life for peasants was fundamentally communal. Families often lived together in cramped quarters, sharing a single room or a few connected spaces. Work was collective, with entire households involved in planting, harvesting, tending animals, and maintaining their homes. Social bonds were critical. Neighbors relied on one another in times of need, whether to repair a roof, harvest crops quickly, or defend against an attack. Isolation was dangerous, not only physically but socially, as the support of the community could be the difference between survival and death. Despite the constant struggle, peasants found ways to experience moments of joy and expression. Festivals, religious holidays, and local markets provided opportunities for socialization, music, and celebration. Marriage, childbirth, and family life brought meaning and continuity. Storytelling, songs, and oral traditions passed knowledge and culture from generation to generation, creating a shared identity rooted in both hardship and resilience. Yet these moments were fleeting, brief interruptions in a life dominated by labor and survival. Peasants were also highly skilled in practical knowledge. They understood the land, the seasons, and the behavior of animals. They could grow crops suited to the soil and climate, preserve food for winter, and improvise tools when resources were scarce. Knowledge was passed orally and experientially. Mistakes could be deadly, so learning was a matter of survival. This expertise, however, rarely translated into wealth or status. No matter how clever or industrious a peasant was, their position in society remained constrained by the rigid feudal system. The social hierarchy itself was a constant reminder of their vulnerability. Lords, knights, and clergy held power that could shape life and death with little notice. Taxes, tithes, and labor obligations were non-negotiable. A lord could demand part of the harvest or labor to build roads, bridges, or fortifications. Refusal could result in punishment, violence, or eviction. Freedom was limited, and the legal system was skewed in favor of the powerful. The life of a peasant was one of obedience, negotiation, and survival under constant oversight. Peasants also faced limited mobility. Traveling to another village or town could be dangerous and expensive. Roads were often poorly maintained, making journeys slow and hazardous. Bandits and wild animals threatened travelers, and permission to cross certain lands or forests was required. Many peasants never left the region where they were born. Their lives were tightly bound to the land they worked, the village they inhabited, and the feudal lord to whom they owed allegiance. The material conditions of life were sparse. Clothing was simple, made from coarse wool or linen, often patched and repaired repeatedly. Shoes were basic or non-existent, leaving feet vulnerable to injury. Homes contained only the most essential furniture: rough wooden tables, benches, straw, filled mattresses, and simple cooking implements. Luxury items were rare or non-existent. Even food was limited, often consisting of bread, vegetables, porridge, and occasionally meat or fish, depending on resources and local restrictions. Nutrition was marginal, contributing to frequent illness and low physical resilience. Education was another privilege largely inaccessible to peasants. Literacy rates were extremely low. Children might learn practical skills from parents, but reading, writing, and arithmetic were rare. Knowledge was passed orally, through demonstration, experience, and local traditions. Religion provided a moral framework, but not intellectual opportunity. Most peasants knew the prayers, the festivals, and the saints' stories, but not much beyond that. Their world was defined by labor, survival, and the immediate demands of life, not abstract thought or scholarly pursuits. Even leisure was defined by scarcity and necessity. Peasants could not afford idleness. Rest was often limited to nights and brief breaks during work. Play, storytelling, and community events were structured around work cycles, such as harvest festivals or market days. The rhythms of life were dictated by the seasons and the land, not personal choice. Despite this, the human spirit found ways to endure, celebrating small victories and moments of beauty amidst hardship. Violence and war shaped not only their lives, but their homes and communities. Villages were often fortified only minimally, if at all. Defensive structures, if present, were modest. Simple palisades, ditches, or walls of earth and timber. Castles and keeps were built for lords, not peasants. When armies marched, peasants were vulnerable. They could flee, hide, or attempt negotiation, but protection was never guaranteed. The threat of destruction, pillaging, or conscription loomed constantly. Even natural disasters carried profound consequences. Floods, fires, storms, and droughts could obliterate the crops, the homes, and sometimes entire communities. Villages were built with an understanding of local geography, but risk could never be eliminated entirely. A river might provide water, but it could also flood. Forests provided timber, but also predators and bandits. The medieval landscape was a mixture of opportunity and peril, demanding constant vigilance and adaptability. Peasants had to master these challenges daily. They developed systems of cooperation and communal labor, shared knowledge about crop rotation and animal husbandry, and relied on local markets to barter for goods they could not produce. These adaptations allowed survival, even in a world that offered little margin for error. Their ingenuity, resourcefulness, and endurance were remarkable, though rarely celebrated by chroniclers who focused on the lives of kings and nobles. Religion, labor, community, fear, and resilience defined the peasant experience. Life was harsh, often cruel, and filled with uncertainty, but it was also deeply human. It was shaped by the immediacy of survival, the bonds of family and community, and the knowledge that each day lived was a day survived. The reality of medieval life for peasants was brutal, but it was also a testament to endurance. Every day they confronted hunger, disease, violence, and the elements, and every day they adapted, finding ways to exist and sustain their families in a world that seemed designed against them. The world of medieval peasants was one of struggle, yes, but also of quiet resilience. It was not an era of castles and kings in any meaningful sense for most people. It was a world of fields, forests, homes carved from soil and timber, and a constant negotiation with survival itself. Understanding this reality allows us to comprehend why, when threats multiplied and conditions became unbearable above ground, peasants sometimes chose to live underground. They did so not out of choice, but out of necessity. They adapted to the harshest conditions humanity has faced, finding ways to endure in silence, shadow, and darkness, carrying life forward beneath the weight of the medieval world. The underground homes of medieval peasants, often called sunken houses or Grubenhäuser, were not mere shelters. They were lifelines. They represented ingenuity born of necessity, a direct response to a world that offered ordinary people almost nothing. To imagine these dwellings, one must first erase modern preconceptions about comfort, hygiene, or architecture. These homes were simple, often rough, hewn and designed for one purpose above all: survival. Every line of soil dug, every timber support placed, every layer of straw or mud applied was a careful decision aimed at protecting a family from the harsh realities above ground. The construction of these sunken homes was in itself a testament to human resilience and resourcefulness. A family would begin by selecting a suitable site, often a slightly elevated patch of land to prevent flooding, but low enough to be concealed from the passing eye. They would dig into the earth, creating a pit that could vary in size depending on the needs of the family. Some were small, just enough for a single household to sleep and cook, while others were larger, allowing space for livestock, storage of grain, and areas for daily work. The depth of the pit was carefully considered. Too shallow, and the home would offer little protection. Too deep, and it became difficult to maintain, ventilate, or access safely. The walls of these homes were the earth itself. Soil was compacted, sometimes reinforced with timber beams or wooden planks to prevent collapse. Mud could be used to seal cracks, creating a barrier against drafts and rainwater. In some regions, stones or clay were incorporated to improve stability. Roofs were typically constructed from timber covered with layers of straw, reeds, or sod. This roofing was not intended to impress. It was functional, keeping out rain, snow, and predators, while blending seamlessly into the landscape above. From a distance, these homes were nearly invisible, small depressions in the earth, easily overlooked by neighbors, raiders, or officials. The invisibility was part of their value. In a world filled with danger, concealment could mean the difference between life and death. Inside, life was constrained by necessity. The space was low, sometimes forcing adults to stoop, and cramped, with families living in close quarters. There were no separate rooms or hallways. Sleeping, cooking, and working all occurred within the same space. A small fire or lamp provided light and heat, though smoke often filled the room, mixing with the damp earth to create a distinct, pungent smell. Furniture was minimal: rough benches, tables, and straw-filled mats for sleeping. Storage was achieved through simple wooden chests, sacks, or small niches dug into the walls. Despite these limitations, these homes were meticulously organized. Every inch of space was used efficiently, reflecting a mindset of frugality, foresight, and practical intelligence. One of the remarkable aspects of these underground homes was their role as multi-functional living spaces. They were not only places to sleep, but also to cook, craft, and work. Food preparation often occurred over a small central hearth, the smoke carefully managed to avoid detection while providing warmth and a place to cook. Families processed grains, prepared vegetables, and cured meats in these confined spaces. Tools for farming or craft were stored nearby, ensuring that daily work could be conducted without exposure to the outside world. Even basic social activities, storytelling, religious practice, and teaching children occurred within these walls, making the sunken house a true microcosm of medieval peasant life. Ventilation was one of the greatest challenges. Without it, smoke from fires could become suffocating, moisture could accumulate, and diseases could spread rapidly. Ingenious solutions were developed. Small openings, covered with woven reeds or wooden grates, allowed air to circulate while keeping out rain, predators, and prying eyes. Chimneys were rare. Often, a small hole in the roof or a vent in the wall sufficed. Despite these innovations, conditions inside remained harsh. Dampness was constant, and the combination of moisture and smoke created an environment that tested the endurance of those who lived there. Yet, these homes were far superior to exposure above ground. They offered shelter from storms, protection from raiders, and insulation against the extremes of winter and summer. The location of these homes was also strategic. Sunken houses were often clustered near fields, water sources, and forests, ensuring access to essential resources. Yet they were usually discreetly placed, avoiding main paths or areas where travelers might pass. This balance of accessibility and concealment was crucial. A home too far from fields increased labor and risk. A home too visible invited danger. Peasants mastered this delicate equilibrium, understanding their environment in ways that modern observers might not immediately appreciate. Their knowledge of the land, soil stability, water flow, and natural camouflage was passed down through generations, forming an unspoken expertise essential for survival. These homes were not uniform. Variations existed across regions, reflecting local materials, climate, and cultural practices. In areas with heavy clay, walls might be reinforced with a combination of timber and clay plaster. In sandy regions, wooden supports were more prominent. Roof construction varied, sometimes flat and covered with turf, sometimes pitched to shed water more effectively. Despite these differences, the underlying principles were the same: concealment, durability, warmth, and protection. The ingenuity of peasants was adaptive, responding to the immediate environment rather than abstract architectural ideals. One of the most significant advantages of underground living was the natural insulation provided by the earth. During the brutal winters of medieval Europe, temperatures above ground could drop below freezing for weeks or months. Snow and ice-covered fields, food became scarce, and hypothermia was a constant threat. Sunken homes, however, maintained a relatively stable temperature year-round. The soil absorbed the cold of winter and the heat of summer, creating an environment that was harsh but survivable. Families could endure storms, frost, and wind in a space that, while uncomfortable, offered protection that a simple wooden hut could never provide. In addition to environmental protection, underground homes provided a level of social security. By being partially hidden, peasants reduced their visibility to raiders, feudal authorities, or rival communities. Smoke could be discreetly vented, footsteps muffled, and light minimized. In times of conflict, families could retreat further into the earth, emerging only when the danger had passed. The sunken house became not only a home but also a refuge, a private space in a world dominated by power, violence, and surveillance. Health and hygiene within these homes were constant concerns. Damp conditions, limited ventilation, and close quarters contributed to the spread of disease, yet peasants were adaptive. They implemented rudimentary drainage systems, sometimes incorporating shallow trenches to direct water away from living areas. Floors were often covered with straw or rushes to absorb moisture and provide some comfort. Personal hygiene practices, while limited by resources, were observed as much as possible. Peasants understood that maintaining a level of cleanliness, however basic, could prevent illness and improve survival chances. Despite the hardships, these homes fostered a sense of agency. Peasants who lived underground had control over their immediate environment in a way they could not above ground. They chose the depth, structure, and placement of their homes. They controlled the light, heat, and smoke within. Even the smallest innovations, reinforced walls, improved ventilation, layered roofs, could make a measurable difference in daily life. In a society where most people had little power over their destinies, the sunken house was a domain of personal ingenuity and decision-making. The role of underground homes in the broader community was also notable. While individual families might build and inhabit sunken houses, clusters of such homes often formed villages or hamlets. These were sometimes semi-hidden communities, providing mutual support while remaining discreet. Families could assist one another with construction, maintenance, and shared labor. Children could play in relative safety, protected by both the earth and the social bonds that tied the community together. In this way, underground homes were not merely shelters, but hubs of resilience, embedding social cohesion into the very soil. Cultural and symbolic aspects of underground living should not be overlooked. The act of living beneath the earth had psychological and symbolic dimensions. Soil and darkness were associated with both protection and mortality. Life and death were intertwined in ways that modern observers might find unsettling. Yet for medieval peasants, this proximity to the earth was normal, even comforting. The ground was constant, reliable, and sustaining. While the world above could be chaotic and dangerous, life beneath the surface offered a fragile stability. It was a daily negotiation with nature and circumstance, one that required skill, knowledge, and courage. Economic factors also reinforced the choice of underground homes. Materials for above-ground construction were scarce or expensive. Stone required quarrying and transport, timber required permission and labor, and both could be taxed or seized by local lords. In contrast, the earth itself was free, abundant, and accessible. By digging into the soil, peasants circumvented many economic and legal restrictions. They created homes with minimal external resources, relying instead on labor, ingenuity, and understanding of their immediate environment. In this sense, sunken houses were a practical solution to systemic economic constraints. Religious and spiritual life intersected with underground living as well. The church permeated every aspect of medieval society, and even peasants with limited resources engaged with faith. Religious symbols, prayers, and observances found their way into sunken homes. Simple crosses, altars, or icons might be placed in corners, offering comfort and guidance. Life underground did not separate peasants from their spiritual world. Rather, it was integrated, reinforcing moral and cultural norms while providing psychological support in a harsh reality. Despite their modest appearance, these homes required careful maintenance. Walls needed regular reinforcement, roofs needed repair after storms, and floors had to be kept dry and manageable. Families devoted significant labor to upkeep, understanding that neglect could lead to collapse, flooding, or disease. This work was ongoing, never complete, and deeply tied to the rhythm of survival. Living underground was not a static condition. It demanded constant engagement with the physical environment, a continuous negotiation between human effort and natural forces. The underground home also played a crucial role in the broader strategy of medieval peasant life. In times of harvest, families could store surplus food below ground, protected from theft, pests, and spoilage. Grain, root vegetables, and preserved meats were hidden within or around the dwelling, accessible yet shielded. Tools and personal belongings could also be stored safely, reducing the risk of loss during raids or conflicts. The sunken house functioned as a hub of domestic, economic, and defensive activity, a multipurpose space reflecting the complex demands of peasant existence. Social hierarchy and labor obligations influenced the design and use of these homes. Peasants were required to work for their lords, providing labor on fields, roads, and construction projects. Their underground homes were designed to allow them to return quickly to these duties while maintaining shelter and protection. They were discreet, ensuring that the lord's oversight did not interfere with daily life beyond mandated obligations. The homes allowed peasants to meet both social and survival demands in an environment where visibility could invite control, taxation, or coercion. In addition, sunken homes were adapted to local environmental challenges. In regions prone to flooding, homes were slightly elevated or incorporated drainage. In colder climates, roofs were layered thickly to retain heat. In windy or exposed areas, walls were reinforced and openings minimized. Peasants possessed a deep understanding of microclimates, soil behavior, and seasonal changes. Their homes reflected this expertise, demonstrating a sophisticated, practical knowledge that modern observers might not immediately recognize. Every feature had a reason, and every modification could mean the difference between comfort, survival, or disaster. The communal and psychological dimensions of underground homes cannot be overstated. Families living in close quarters developed strong internal bonds. Children learned skills and survival strategies from parents and elders, knowledge that was essential for maintaining the home and enduring harsh conditions. Storytelling, song, and ritual continued inside the confined spaces, keeping cultural memory alive. Even in darkness and isolation, these homes were vibrant centers of human life, preserving identity, knowledge, and continuity across generations. Finally, underground homes were a direct reflection of the medieval peasant's relationship with the natural world. Soil was not simply a medium for construction, it was a living, responsive environment. Peasants understood its properties, its limitations, and its potential. They worked with the earth rather than against it, integrating their homes into the landscape rather than imposing upon it. This relationship was intimate, practical, and deeply informed by experience. By living underground, peasants demonstrated not only resilience but also a profound understanding of the environment, a skill set that ensured survival in a world that offered little else. Sunken houses, therefore, were far more than shelters. They were centers of domestic life, defensive structures, storage spaces, and cultural hubs. They represented ingenuity, adaptation, and resilience in the face of environmental, social, and economic pressures. Through them, medieval peasants carved out spaces of survival, creating microcosms of life beneath the soil, where ordinary people could endure, thrive, and protect themselves from a world that was often unforgiving and merciless. Medieval winters were merciless, stretching on for months with an unyielding cold that crept into every home, every garment, and every body. Unlike today, there were no central heating systems, no insulated walls, no synthetic fabrics to trap warmth. Peasants had only what they could create with their own hands and the resources the land provided. Woolen clothing, ruffs, spun linen, and layers of fur were the first line of defense, but they were often insufficient against biting winds and frost that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. The cold was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and weakened immune systems made even ordinary illnesses potentially lethal. Food scarcity exacerbated the problem. The longer the winter, the more quickly stores of grain, vegetables, and preserved meats dwindled. Hunger amplified the cold, and the cold intensified the hunger. Survival was a delicate balance, and every decision could mean the difference between life and death. It was in this context that the underground homes of peasants proved invaluable. Sunken houses were not merely shelters, they were natural insulators. By digging into the earth, peasants leveraged the thermal properties of soil. The ground absorbs the extremes of temperature, remaining cooler in summer and warmer in winter. This meant that while the snow piled high above and the wind howled across the fields, life inside a sunken home remained tolerable even when the world outside was inhospitable. The earth provided a steady, moderate environment, a buffer against the unpredictability of medieval weather. Families could sleep, work, and store food without the constant fear that a storm would destroy their home or that freezing temperatures would claim their lives. Constructing such a home required careful understanding of the soil, local climate, and seasonal patterns. Too shallow a pit, and the house would provide little protection from wind and cold. Too deep, and the home risked flooding or collapse. Timber supports were strategically placed to reinforce walls and roofs, preventing the weight of the soil from crushing the structure. Roofs were layered with straw, reeds, or sod, creating additional insulation and keeping moisture out. The design was not elegant, it was functional, optimized for warmth, safety, and concealment. Every aspect of the home reflected knowledge honed through generations of trial and error. Peasants understood that survival depended on respecting the limits of materials and the forces of nature. Inside, life was carefully organized around the central fire, which served multiple purposes. It provided warmth, allowed for cooking, and offered light in the otherwise dark interior. Fire was a precious resource, and managing it required skill. Smoke had to be vented, usually through small holes or rudimentary chimneys, to prevent suffocation. Wood was scarce, and fire could not be left unattended. Peasants learned to regulate the heat, ensuring it was sufficient to keep the family warm, but not so large as to waste fuel or attract attention. Cooking itself became a balancing act, preparing food without producing excessive smoke, while maintaining heat to prevent freezing during long, dark nights. The earth around the home also helped regulate moisture. Winter snow and rain could seep into poorly constructed dwellings, creating damp, cold conditions that encouraged illness. Sunken houses often incorporated drainage trenches or slightly sloped floors to direct water away from living spaces. Floors were covered with straw, rushes, or mats made from reeds, providing insulation from the cold, damp soil below. Families layered these materials, replacing or refreshing them as needed to maintain a tolerable living environment. While it was far from comfortable by modern standards, these measures demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of environmental adaptation. Temperature stability inside sunken homes had another critical advantage: food preservation. Medieval peasants lacked modern refrigeration. Perishable items like milk, cheese, root vegetables, and meat had to be stored carefully to avoid spoilage. The consistent coolness of underground homes allowed for better preservation of these essentials, extending their shelf life through harsh winters. Grain, the staple of the peasant diet, could be stored safely in dry corners or raised containers, protected from moisture and rodents. By combining insulation, careful storage, and attention to airflow, peasants maximized their limited resources, ensuring that the family could survive even during the coldest months. Winter also brought limited daylight, and underground homes amplified this scarcity. Peasants had to rely on small fires or lamps for illumination. Smoke and soot were inevitable, but light and warmth were necessary. In these conditions, families developed routines that conserved energy and prioritized essential tasks. Work that required daylight, such as field labor or foraging, was curtailed. Instead, the winter months were often devoted to indoor activities, mending tools, repairing homes, preparing clothing, and other tasks that contributed to survival. These routines were dictated not by desire or leisure, but by the rhythms of nature and the imperatives of endurance. The cold winter months also heightened the dangers of disease. Damp, poorly ventilated conditions encouraged respiratory illnesses, while malnutrition weakened immune systems. Peasants were acutely aware of the need for cleanliness and care, even with limited resources. Simple practices, changing bedding straw, sweeping floors, and ventilating when possible, helped reduce risks. Herbs and other natural remedies were employed to treat minor ailments. Knowledge about seasonal illnesses and preventive practices was passed down orally, a crucial aspect of maintaining health in an environment where medical intervention was minimal. Survival depended on attention to these details. The physical design of underground homes also reflected the psychological realities of winter. Being enclosed, often with low ceilings and narrow openings, created a sense of containment and security. While this could be oppressive, it also provided reassurance. Above ground, winter storms were visible, unpredictable, and terrifying. Below ground, the family was shielded from the elements. The walls of earth became a protective barrier, a constant reminder that while the world outside was harsh and dangerous, the space within could be controlled, managed, and endured. The home itself became a source of psychological comfort, a small domain of stability amid an otherwise chaotic environment. Winter survival was not only about warmth and shelter, but also about resource management. Firewood had to be collected and stored well before the first frost. Grain and preserved foods were rationed carefully. Livestock, when kept, required fodder and protection. Peasants developed strategies for coping with scarcity, often coordinating with neighbors to share resources, labor, or knowledge. Social bonds were critical in these months, and underground homes often became the centers of communal activity. Families visited one another, exchanged goods, and shared information about local conditions. In this way, the homes were not isolated refuges, but nodes in a network of survival and cooperation. The underground design also allowed for gradual adaptation to worsening conditions. If the cold intensified, families could add layers of insulation, reinforce walls, or deepen the pit to improve warmth. They could modify the hearth, adjust ventilation, and rearrange living spaces to optimize heat retention. This flexibility was essential. Medieval winters were unpredictable. Some years were harsher than others, with early frosts, heavy snow, or extended cold spells. The ability to modify the home in response to environmental changes was a critical aspect of peasant ingenuity. Winter also shaped social and economic practices. Labor above ground was limited to the daylight hours that remained, and even then, snow and ice restricted movement. Peasants focused on preserving their livelihoods, tending stored crops, preparing tools and clothing, and maintaining homes. These activities were often communal, with families helping one another. Underground homes facilitated this work, providing sheltered spaces to conduct necessary tasks without exposure to the elements. Winter, in this sense, became a season of adaptation, preparation, and endurance rather than idle rest. Beyond survival, underground homes played a defensive role during winter. Cold, snow-covered landscapes exposed vulnerabilities. Above, ground shelters could be easily spotted, smoke from fires visible against the white snow, tracks leading directly to homes. Sunken houses minimized visibility, allowing families to remain concealed. In times of conflict or raid, the natural camouflage of earth provided a strategic advantage. The very design of these homes reflected an understanding of risk management, blending environmental adaptation with defense. The winter months also had profound psychological effects on peasants. Darkness, cold, and scarcity created stress, anxiety, and fear. Underground homes, however, offered a small but meaningful measure of control. Families could organize their spaces, control fire and light, manage food stores, and maintain relative safety. This sense of agency, however limited, was critical to psychological endurance. Survival in the medieval world depended not only on physical resilience, but also on mental fortitude. Underground homes contributed to both, providing a tangible framework for life in a hostile environment. In addition, winter survival fostered innovation. Families developed creative solutions to challenges posed by cold, darkness, and scarcity. Simple technologies such as insulated bedding, layered walls, and ventilated fire pits reflected iterative learning over generations. These innovations were practical, low-tech, and highly effective. They demonstrate the sophistication of peasant knowledge, challenging assumptions that medieval peasants lived in ignorance or helplessness. Survival required intelligence, adaptability, and an intimate understanding of the environment. The role of children in winter survival was also significant. Young members of the family contributed to gathering fuel, tending livestock, maintaining the home, and assisting with food preparation. Education, while informal, was deeply practical. Children learned to read the landscape, recognize weather patterns, and apply survival strategies. Underground homes provided a controlled environment for this education, shielding children from immediate danger while allowing them to participate in daily tasks critical to the family's endurance. Winter survival also depended on religious and cultural practices. Peasants engaged in rituals, prayers, and observances that offered comfort and structure. Seasonal festivals, though limited by harsh conditions, provided opportunities for social cohesion, cultural continuity, and psychological relief. Underground homes became spaces where these practices could be maintained, even when external circumstances were grim. Faith, ritual, and shared belief were integrated into survival strategies, reinforcing resilience and fostering hope. The earth itself became a partner in winter survival. Soil absorbed moisture, retained heat, and provided structural stability. Peasants recognized these properties, designing homes that leveraged the natural advantages of the environment. Knowledge of soil types, drainage, and thermal properties informed construction choices. Survival was a collaborative process between humans and the land, requiring observation, experimentation, and adaptation. In this sense, the underground home was not just a shelter. It was a sophisticated integration of human ingenuity and environmental understanding. The winter months also emphasized the interconnectedness of survival strategies. Fire, insulation, food storage, hygiene, social cooperation, and environmental knowledge were all interdependent. A failure in one area could compromise others. Underground homes facilitated this integration by providing a central, controlled space where these strategies could be applied cohesively. They were living systems, designed to optimize endurance in a season that tested every aspect of peasant life. In conclusion, winter survival for medieval peasants was an intricate, multifaceted challenge. Underground homes were not simply shelters. They were hubs of adaptation, innovation, and resilience. By leveraging the insulating properties of soil, designing functional living spaces, managing fire and light, preserving food, and integrating social and cultural practices, peasants created environments that allowed them to endure some of the harshest conditions in European history. These homes were a testament to human ingenuity, a profound understanding of the natural world, and an enduring commitment to survival in the face of relentless adversity. The medieval world was defined by danger, and nowhere was that danger more immediate than in the daily lives of peasants. While kings and nobles fought battles for land, power, and prestige, the consequences of those struggles fell directly on the shoulders of ordinary people. Villages were not insulated from conflict. They were exposed, vulnerable, and often the first targets in any military campaign or raid. In this context, underground homes, sunken houses, or Grubenhäuser were not merely shelters from the elements or spaces for domestic life. They were strategic adaptations to a world ruled by violence, unpredictability, and fear. To understand why peasants chose to live below the surface, one must first understand the constant threat that hovered over them. Raids were a daily, lurking possibility. In many regions of Europe, armed groups moved swiftly and unpredictably. Vikings, long before fading into legend, struck coastal and riverine communities with precision, seeking food, wealth, and slaves. Bandits and brigands roamed forests and open plains alike, attacking travelers and isolated homes. Feudal lords might even send their own men to enforce taxes or punish disobedience, often with little concern for human life. For peasants, safety was never assumed. Every journey, every trip to fetch water, every planting and harvesting season carried the potential for violence. Above ground homes, visible and stationary, became easy targets. Smoke from cooking fires, footprints leading to the door, or the glint of tools and possessions could attract attention from those who had no interest in mercy. Sunken houses offered a measure of concealment that was invaluable in this context. By digging into the earth, peasants reduced their visibility, making it harder for raiders to identify habitation from a distance. Smoke could be vented subtly, escaping through small vents or cracks in the roof, rather than a chimney that announced life for miles. The contours of the land masked entrances, and the materials used for construction, timber, straw, and mud, blended seamlessly with the natural environment. From above, a village of underground homes might appear as nothing more than irregularities in the terrain, a subtle dip or patch of disturbed earth. This invisibility was not a luxury, it was a vital defense mechanism. The placement of homes was also strategic. Families often chose locations near resources, fields, water sources, and forest, yet away from main roads, villages, or open areas where travelers might pass. This balance between accessibility and concealment required intimate knowledge of the local environment. Peasants observed the behavior of raiders, the patterns of patrols, and the movement of armies. They understood which areas were prone to attack and which offered natural cover. The decision of where to dig was not arbitrary. It was informed by survival instincts honed over generations. Geography became a weapon, and the sunken home was a tool in the ongoing negotiation between life and danger. Inside these homes, families developed routines to minimize risk. Daily activities such as cooking, tool repair, and childcare were conducted with awareness of exposure. Fires were small, controlled, and often shielded to prevent detection. Noise was kept to a minimum, especially during times of heightened threat. Children learned early how to move quietly, respond to signs of danger, and hide when necessary. The underground home was both a living space and a training ground, teaching the skills required to endure in a world where visibility could be fatal. The threat of violence was not abstract. It was immediate and tangible. Historical records, though sparse regarding ordinary peasants, recount countless accounts of villages destroyed, families killed, and property seized. Armies on campaign often demanded provisions, livestock, or labor, and refusal could result in brutal punishment. Raiding parties, whether organized or opportunistic, moved quickly and with devastating effect. A village above ground with smoke rising from chimneys and livestock grazing in open fields, was a beacon of wealth in a landscape of scarcity. Sunken houses disrupted this visibility, offering concealment and, in some cases, a chance to survive where above ground communities might perish. Even the smallest details of home construction were influenced by the need for defense. Entrances were often narrow, allowing a single person to pass at a time, making forced entry difficult. Doors might be reinforced with wood or simple locks, and openings were positioned strategically to allow observation while minimizing exposure. Interior layouts prioritized quick access to hiding spaces or exits. Families developed emergency plans, where to retreat, how to signal one another, and when to flee entirely. The underground home was not just a dwelling. It was a defensive mechanism, a micro-fortress embedded in the landscape. In addition to raiders and soldiers, the medieval world was rife with interpersonal violence. Disputes over land, livestock, or resources could escalate quickly, particularly in regions where legal oversight was weak or biased toward the powerful. Peasants were not immune to these conflicts. Living underground reduced the likelihood of direct confrontation, providing a private space where disputes could be managed within the family or local community rather than in public, exposed settings. The architecture of concealment created both safety and autonomy, allowing peasants to navigate the social complexities of their world on their own terms when possible. Social and economic hierarchies further amplified the dangers faced by peasants. Lords and knights wielded power that could dictate life or death. Taxes, tithes, and forced labor were constant obligations. Failure to comply could result in violent enforcement. Above ground homes were visible markers of occupancy and potential wealth, making them easy targets for levies, raids, or extortion. Sunken houses minimized this visibility, allowing families to meet obligations while reducing exposure. In this way, underground living was not just a response to natural threats, but a tactical adaptation to the social and political landscape. The design of underground homes also reflected an understanding of human behavior. Peasants recognized that raiders often relied on sightlines and predictability. A small, inconspicuous depression in the earth could evade detection, while irregular entrances, camouflaged roofs, and careful placement of smoke vents disrupted patterns that attackers might exploit. Families became adept at reading their surroundings, anticipating movement, and adjusting daily routines to reduce risk. The home became both a shield and a classroom, teaching situational awareness, strategic thinking, and the subtle art of concealment. During times of heightened threat, underground homes provided not only protection but also psychological reassurance. The knowledge that one could retreat into the earth, shielded from view and partially insulated from danger, reduced anxiety and allowed families to function even under duress. While life underground was uncomfortable, damp, and dark, it offered a measure of control in an otherwise uncontrollable world. Survival depended on this sense of agency, on the ability to manipulate the environment to one's advantage, and on the skills learned through generations of living close to both danger and the earth itself. In addition to immediate defense, underground homes allowed for the preservation of resources. Food, tools, and personal belongings could be stored safely out of sight, reducing the risk of theft during raids or conflicts. Grain, vegetables, and preserved meats were protected from scavengers and bandits. Livestock, when small enough to accommodate, could be housed partially underground or nearby in hidden pens. Every element of the home was optimized for survival, demonstrating the interconnectedness of domestic life, defense, and resource management. The communal aspect of underground living also contributed to security. Families often clustered their sunken homes in proximity, forming semi-hidden hamlets. Neighbors could warn one another of approaching danger, coordinate defensive measures, or assist during emergencies. This network of mutual support enhanced survival chances and fostered social cohesion. While each home was individually concealed, together they formed a resilient microcommunity capable of withstanding threats that might overwhelm isolated households. Raids and violence were not limited to distant armies. The medieval world was rife with opportunistic threats. Bandits, deserters, and even rival peasants could pose dangers. Underground homes minimized the chance of detection, allowing families to maintain a degree of autonomy and safety, even when law enforcement or local authorities were absent or unreliable. Concealment and preparedness became central to daily life, shaping routines, family organization, and long-term planning. The psychological impact of this constant threat was profound. Fear was a constant companion, shaping behavior, priorities, and relationships. Underground homes mitigated some of this anxiety, creating spaces where families could organize, rest, and plan without immediate exposure to danger. The earth itself became a protective ally, offering both literal and symbolic shelter. Life underground demanded resilience, adaptability, and a clear understanding of risk. It taught lessons that extended beyond physical survival, influencing decision-making, social interactions, and cultural practices. The role of underground homes during raids also highlights the ingenuity of medieval peasants. Small innovations, hidden storage, escape tunnels, reinforced entrances, smoke vents, could mean the difference between survival and death. Families experimented with layouts, materials, and techniques, passing knowledge from one generation to the next. This was a form of practical engineering born not of academic study, but of necessity, experience, and intimate familiarity with the environment. Survival in a hostile world required both creativity and discipline. Conflict also influenced the rhythm of daily life. Work, meals, and family interactions were structured around risk assessment. Children learned to observe, anticipate, and react to threats. Fire management, noise control, and movement within the home were all informed by defensive considerations. Underground living became a constant exercise in vigilance, balancing the demands of daily life with the omnipresent possibility of attack. The home was simultaneously a living space and a defensive platform, reflecting the inseparability of domestic and protective needs. Furthermore, underground homes enabled families to endure periods of prolonged conflict. During times of war, when above-ground structures were destroyed or occupied by hostile forces, sunken houses offered continuity. Families could shelter, maintain food stores, and survive until the danger passed. In some cases, underground homes allowed communities to outlast invasions, natural disasters, or political upheavals. The earth provided a measure of stability and continuity in an otherwise chaotic environment. The very act of living underground fostered a deep connection to the environment. Soil, stone, timber, and vegetation were not merely building materials, they were partners in survival. Peasants observed patterns of weather, the behavior of the land, and the movement of potential threats. Homes were constructed with an understanding of these forces, integrating natural features into defensive strategies. Concealment, insulation, and fortification were not separate concerns. They were interdependent elements of a holistic approach to survival. Finally, the choice to live underground illustrates the adaptive intelligence of medieval peasants. These homes were responses to a world where danger was constant, resources were scarce, and authority was often oppressive. They combined practicality, defensive strategy, environmental knowledge, and social organization into spaces that allowed life to continue against extraordinary odds. In essence, underground homes were more than shelters. They were instruments of resilience, autonomy, and survival. The medieval peasant living beneath the earth understood that safety was not granted. It had to be created. Through careful construction, strategic placement, and the integration of daily routines with environmental awareness, underground homes provided a measure of control in a world defined by chaos. They were not perfect, comfortable, or permanent, but they were effective. They allowed ordinary people to endure extraordinary danger, preserving life, family, and community in a landscape dominated by violence and uncertainty. Through these homes, peasants demonstrated ingenuity, courage, and the capacity to adapt. They leveraged the earth itself as a protective ally, transforming a simple pit into a complex, multi-functional living space capable of withstanding both environmental extremes and human threats. Underground homes were not only practical but symbolic, representing the resilience of the human spirit in the face of relentless adversity. In the shadows of medieval society, beneath the surface of the land, life persisted, hidden, protected, and determined. Life underground was not merely a strategy for survival. It was a complete redefinition of daily existence. To inhabit the earth was to exist in constant negotiation with both the natural world and the social structures that governed medieval life. The sunken houses of peasants, Grubenhauser, as archaeologists often call them, were more than functional shelters. They were living ecosystems, microcosms of human resilience where the rhythms of family, work, and culture converged under conditions of constraint and ingenuity. Daily life in a sunken home required meticulous organization. Every corner, every layer of straw, every piece of furniture was placed with intention. Space was limited, ceilings were low, sometimes forcing adults to stoop while walking, and rooms were cramped, housing entire families, sometimes with livestock or storage for crops. Yet despite these constraints, life persisted. Families adapted to the confines of their homes with routines, habits, and ingenuity that allowed them not only to survive, but to maintain a sense of order, identity, and continuity. Cooking was central to daily life and a task of both necessity and ritual. Fires were small, managed carefully to conserve precious wood and to limit smoke that could betray the location of the home. Hearths were often placed centrally, serving as the focal point for heat, light, and social gathering. Cooking involved more than simply preparing food. It was a complex exercise in resource management. Grain had to be ground, vegetables preserved, and meat stored safely. Boiling water, roasting roots, or baking bread required coordination and skill. Every meal was a demonstration of practical knowledge passed down through generations. The diet of underground peasants was modest but carefully managed to maximize nutrition. Bread, often coarse and made from rye or barley, formed the staple. Root vegetables such as turnips, carrots, and onions were preserved in cellars or under straw. Legumes, when available, provided protein. Occasionally, meat or fish supplemented the diet, but it was rare and often reserved for special occasions. Food scarcity meant that meals were rationed carefully and knowledge of preservation, through drying, salting, or smoking, was vital. Survival depended on understanding the properties of food, its seasonal availability, and how to stretch limited resources across weeks or months. Family life in underground homes was both intimate and intense. Privacy was minimal. All members of the household shared the same confined space. Children slept alongside parents or siblings, learning from an early age the skills necessary for survival.